Each year as I begin my garden, one of my first and primary goals is to be able to grow enough tomatoes to preserve all of the tomato products that our family will use for the entire year. Products like salsa, spaghetti sauce, tomato paste, diced tomatoes, you name it, that's my goal. And to do that, I grow mostly paste tomatoes. And what I wanted to share with you today are 5 paste tomatoes that I've grown in my garden this year, the pros and cons of each, and how you can use these in your garden if you're seeking to grow enough tomatoes to preserve to last your family as well. First things first, if you're new to gardening, you may wonder, what is a paste tomato and do you have to have paste tomatoes to preserve? Well, the answer to the second question is no. You can preserve any tomato that you grow, so don't feel like you have to grow a paste tomato. But the benefit to a paste tomato is that it actually has thicker walls and more flesh, less juice. So think of a thick, hearty tomato sauce. That's usually made with a paste tomato because of the amount of content in the walls, the thickness of the tomato itself. That's why for me, a paste tomato can go a lot further when I'm preserving than a slicing tomato that is just a lot of juice. Don't get me wrong, there's a place for slicing tomatoes, but when it comes to preserving, the paste is what I want to focus on. So let's talk about my #1 favorite paste tomato to grow for preserving. #1 for me is the San Marzano. Now, we've had a really tough tomato year this year in Arkansas. Like much of the country, we've been dealing with a lot of heat, and tomatoes in general have trouble setting fruit when the daytime temperatures exceed 90, 95. We've been there for about 7 weeks, and the nighttime temperatures exceed about 75. They're gonna have a hard time producing fruit. But I have to tell you that the San Marzanos this year have produced all season long. Not as heavily as in other years, but it still did not completely shut down production like other tomatoes did. This is about the size of a San Marzano, although they can get bigger when growing conditions are better. Just like other paste tomatoes, they are full of thick walls. And what I like too about this size is that when I'm preserving tomato sauce, I use the KitchenAid fruit and vegetable strainer attachment to my KitchenAid mixer. I just run this through the strainer and it gives me sauce that I simmer down. And one thing too, the little things matter. When I pick this off, the stem stays on the plant, so I don't have to worry about usually picking all of that off. So all I have to do is half it, put it through the strainer, and it just makes it good to go. San Marzanos also, even though they're indeterminate tomatoes, which means they'll keep growing and growing and they'll keep producing through the season, they do give a heavy fruit set early on in the season. So if you don't grow as many San Marzanos as I do, you still have a chance to have enough bulk to be able to make the canning or preserving worth it. The one negative I've seen with the San Marzanos this year is that because we have not gotten much rain and I've had trouble keeping my irrigation up to speed, they have had trouble with blossom end rot more than some of my other varieties. But I really do believe if I would have been more on top of watering, that wouldn't have been the case, because on the times that I was on top of watering, the blossom end rot got better. But that's something to keep in mind, just to keep these watered. These are growing in straw bales and they produce really, really well for a paste tomato. #2 on my list is actually a brand new paste tomato, the first time I've ever grown it, and that is the pink Fang. This is an heirloom tomato that I got the seeds from Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds, and I got it because you can see that the shape is very long and it goes through my KitchenAid strainer attachment very easily. And I thought, let's try this, and I have been so impressed. Okay, so for the fruit itself, what I love about it is extremely meaty, hardly any juice, and so this makes for very thick product, a very thick sauce, but that's just the beginning. What I've loved about the pink Fang tomato this year, and I only grew a couple of them because it was a brand new one in my garden and I grew them in my straw bales, was that this produced in the heat all summer long, and I hardly had any incidents of blossom end rot at all, even though it got watered at the same rate as the San Marzanos in this same setup with my straw bales. And it just kept producing, This is one that I'm saving seeds for next year, because the only drawback is it produces very few seeds, and so that would probably explain why I didn't get many seeds in the seed packet. But I'm gonna be putting this in my garden in the future because this one really stood out to me this year. And if you're looking for a workhorse paste tomato that will do well in the heat, then Pink Fang is one I'd recommend you try. Now, I will say that I was really worried at the beginning of the season when it was kind of cool in the spring. I wasn't sure that the plants were gonna make it. They didn't like the cool weather. So if you do try to plant Pink Fang, I would make sure that you're well past your average last frost date because it didn't like the cold and it struggled then. But in the heat, this thing was a star. Number 3 is the Amish Paste. The Amish Paste is a paste tomato that I have grown for many, many years. And it does have some drawbacks, but the reason that I grow it each year is because when it has good conditions, when it can grow to be the best it can be, it's a pretty large and meaty tomato. Now, I love the Amish Paste for recipes that I don't put through my KitchenAid strainer because it's so much bigger. So anything that I have to blanch to be able to peel or throw it in the freezer and then defrost it to peel, or my favorite, I love throwing these on the grill to be able to get the skin off, and then you have this beautiful roasted tomato taste for salsas and things like that. This is just so much easier because it's such a big tomato to be able to do that with. And like I said, when grown in ideal conditions, it can produce a lot of pounds per plant. The drawback with the Amish Paste, especially if you live in an area where summers get hot or you have a freak hot summer like we've had this year, is that the Amish Paste does not like the heat. In fact, when we were getting up into the upper 90s and hundreds, it did not produce at all. Maybe 1 or 2 fruit for like 8 plants. So it doesn't like the heat. The flowers will completely fry off. But to get around that, you may notice that the tomatoes aren't the only thing growing here. I've got the Amish Paste tomatoes here in the tomato cages, but I've also got black-eyed peas that are growing on either side. And I did that strategically because I know Amish Paste doesn't like the heat, and because those fruits can get pretty big if they have too much contact with sun, they can get sun scald. And so I actually grew these black-eyed peas to be able to help shade the plant. Now, it's too early to tell. I'm recording this at the very end of July, but my hope is that because Amish Paste, like San Marzano and Pink Fang, are indeterminate tomatoes, I'm hoping that they will eventually start producing once the temperatures come down a little bit. And hopefully the shade just helped the plant itself to be able to live well through the heat. That's my goal, we'll see. Another thing about Amish Paste that can be tricky is that if you have springs or even summers that are really rainy, I found that it tends to have a harder time with your fungal diseases like early blight and septoria leaf spot. That hasn't been as much of an issue this year because we haven't had a lot of rain, but early in the season I have to probably stay on top of trimming those lower leaves that are turning yellow due to those blight conditions. I have to stay on top of that more on Amish Paste than I do on the other tomatoes. So those are a couple of the drawbacks with Amish Paste. That's why I don't grow my entire garden with Amish Paste, but I love having several plants because if we do get one of those good seasons where it doesn't get too hot too fast, I can get a really great bumper crop of these nice, large, meaty paste tomatoes. So we've talked about 3 different indeterminate tomatoes. These are ones that are going to grow all season long unless it's stopped by disease or some other factors. Now let's look at 2 determinate tomatoes that I am depending on with my tomato preserving. The next tomato I depend on for my preserving is the Roma tomato. This is one I've grown from my very first season, and it's one that I depend on year after year. The benefit of the Roma tomato is that because it is a determinate tomato, it will produce all of its fruit usually in the course of 3 to 4 weeks, which means that that's an ideal way to be able to do a lot of canning all at once. It also, because it's an indeterminate tomato and the fruits don't get all that large, it comes to fruiting earlier, which means in my hot climate, we're able to get typically a really good harvest before the heat sets in and starts to shut down production of the other tomato plants. Although I have to say these tomatoes, these Romas, have done really well in the heat in general. They love lots of compost, and the good thing is you don't have to worry about pruning them. In fact, pruning them, unless you're taking off some disease, is actually going to hurt your harvest. So as long as you get them staked in a way that works out for the supporting of the flowers, the fruit, the stems, all of that, you really don't have to do anything else to them. They're very low maintenance. So for me, the Romas are the tomato that I'm always going to be putting in my garden because I know I can depend on it year after year. But I have to say that as much as I love the Roma tomatoes, I have found a new paste tomato that is a determinate tomato this year that might actually be rivaling how much I love Romas, and here's why. Here we have the end of the season of a new favorite paste tomato of mine, and that is the Paisano. The Paisano, like the Roma, is a determinate tomato, so it grows to a set height, which these were about maybe 2 feet, so they were actually kind of small, and then they produce all of their fruit at once, similar to the Roma. Why I was really impressed with the Paisano this year is because, number one, it started fruiting before any of my other tomatoes, even before Romas. And so it was able to give me a good harvest before the heat set in. And number two, the fruits were 2 to 3 times as large as the Roma tomatoes. So we got a really good, solid, meaty paste tomato in a short amount of time. Now, this is my second year growing Paisano. Last year, I put them in the area of my garden, which nothing really produced very well. We had a late freeze. We just had a lot of things that were kind of working against it. And I'm so glad that I didn't give up on it last year, because this year they have done so well. I'm going to continue to test them and maybe grow them even more and maybe fewer of the Romas, just to see if they continue to do well. Again, they fruit really quickly, they're large, they're easy to maintain. I only had to do a couple of rows of this Florida weave, and they didn't overtake the area. And so for me, Paisano is going to be a new one I'm going to be incorporating into my garden next year to see if it continues to perform as well as it did this year. I hope you've enjoyed this look into 5 paste tomatoes I grew this year and why I love them. What paste tomatoes do you grow? Are there any others that you think that I should try in my garden next year? I'm always looking for new ones. Put them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in growing enough tomatoes to be able to last your family in preservation, check out my mini course, Harvest to Kitchen Tomatoes, where I bring you inside of my kitchen and I show you how I harvest and preserve the tomatoes that last our family all year. Thank you so much for watching, and like and subscribe to see more garden content like this in the future.